This is Lecture 15 of the History of the United States since 1865. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the post-war family, gender, and consumer society. Your readings for today's class include one primary source, The Coming War on Women by Willard Waller, and Chapter 4 of Lisbeth Cohen's book, The Consumer's Republic. In our popular culture, we tend to remember the immediate post-war period, and particularly the 1950s, as a period of great social stability and abundance. And there is some truth to that. This was a period of great economic growth and great affluence. President Dwight Eisenhower, who was the President of the United States from 1953 until 1961, was actually symptomatic of that age. He was enormously popular and had great traction and great support through really all segments of the American population. Although he was a Republican, there were many Democrats who considered him to be a great president. His campaign slogan was "I like Ike." His nickname was Ike. And there's actually some truth to that. A lot of Americans liked Ike. It was kind of hard not to like him. He was a very sort of avuncular figure who seemed to want what was best for America. He was a war hero, being commander of American and Allied forces during the Second World War. And in many ways, he sort of represented this sort of coming together of a national consensus in America about, how good America could be. Now, we're going to be talking about that in more detail as we go on, but we also need to talk about the fact that when we talk about the affluence of the 1950s, this is mostly the affluence of the white middle class. Now, the middle class does grow in the 1950s, but the people who benefit really most from this are white Americans. However, the economic booms and the wartime experience helped to extend both what the term middle class means, but also it helped to sort of instantiate or consolidate, if you will, a meaning of whiteness and white citizenship. One of the main drivers for the post-war economic boom, in fact, was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, in many ways, is kind of the last of the New Deal programs, and it was meant to deal with a very specific set of circumstances. As the Second World War was beginning to draw to a close, there were people in government, in the Roosevelt administration and later in the Truman administration, who wanted to avoid, many of the dislocations that had occurred after the First World War. There was also a strong incentive to prevent the kind of economic crisis that could lead once again into a depression. There was this sense in 1944 that, look, we're going to win, and not only are we going to win the war, we're going to win the peace. The other thing, of course, is it was meant to deal with the fact that 14 million American men, a little over 13 million in the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps, and another million in the Merchant Navy, we're going to be coming home. And that's actually a fairly significant problem if you think about it. These are 14 million Americans who have spent the last 2.5 years learning all sorts of creative ways to kill people. You don't want these people to be loose on the streets with no kind of support for them, unemployed, and desperate. The last thing you want is a desperate, stone-cold killer. I mean, that's the cynical side of it. The less cynical side of it is this, that in 1944, it was abundantly clear that the United States and its allies were going to win the Second World War. After the Normandy landing and, through the summer of 1944, it really was just a matter of time. And there was a strong sense that America owed these men something for their service. There was this sense that, look, these were guys, many of whom volunteered, many of whom were drafted, but nonetheless, stood up and did their duty for the nation, and therefore the nation really had an obligation to help them out. Now, the GI Bill did a whole lot of very important and very interesting things. For one thing, is that it was designed to help returning veterans establish themselves in a better economic circumstance than they had known before the war. There were loans for servicemen for education, for buying homes and starting businesses. The idea was that if you served in the armed forces and you come home, you should have the opportunity to improve yourself, to improve your career. This is one of the reasons why one of the central elements of the GI Bill were low interest and often no interest loans for education. There were opportunities for veterans to buy homes. The GI Bill created a whole network of services that allowed veterans to get mortgages with no money down and at extremely low rates to buy homes or to start businesses. It also guaranteed 1 year of unemployment compensation following demobilization. So what the GI Bill did, in many ways, was it guaranteed that we didn't have 14 million men coming home to America and putting a drag on the economy. It put money in their pockets through the unemployment compensation, but also gave them access to financial and commercial instruments to buy things, and it turned them into consumers as soon as they got off the boat and back to America. Of course, one of the things that this does is it helps stimulate the economy. All of a sudden there are 14 million new consumers in America who are helping to stimulate the economy. I'm going to talk about some of the broader consequences of this in just a moment, but there is something that I think we need to pause and discuss, and that is the fact that the GI Bill actually did come with some strings attached. For one thing, you could only qualify for GI Bill benefits if you had an honorable discharge. Anything less than an honorable discharge automatically disqualified you from the GI Bill. Now, of course, this meant that if you had an administrative discharge or things didn't work out, you didn't get it. Veterans also had to have been mobilized to an active war zone, that is, seen active service in combat, in order to qualify for GI Bill benefits. So if you stayed at home in the United States and you worked as a typist in a Fort Bragg or something like that, you didn't qualify for the GI Bill. It also meant that if you were an African American who had joined the armed forces during the 1940s, hoping to defend your country, and the odds were that you weren't going to see combat because of the segregated nature of the armed forces at this time, you also didn't qualify for GI Bill benefits. Now, what happened, of course, was that this meant that the vast majority of beneficiaries of the GI Bill were white, and disproportionate to the number of the racial makeup of the armed forces, primarily because African American troops did not have the opportunity to serve in combat and therefore did not qualify for these benefits. Now, this is very important because one of the things that the GI Bill does is we will see in a moment, it defines economic citizenship. It's what allows people to participate directly in the growing post-war economy. It also helps to define manhood and masculinity in this period. The historian Gary Gerstle talks about the Second World War as kind of a crucible of American identity, where service in the armed forces in many ways is what defines your social value even in peacetime. And this is one of the reasons why when we look at some of the main great political leaders in the post-war period, one of the things that they tend to emphasize is their military service. John F. Kennedy served in the United States Navy, as did Richard Nixon, and this was something that they tended to point out in their political careers. Joseph McCarthy was a Marine Corps intelligence officer during the Second World War, and although he didn't actually see combat, he did tend to lie about his military service, because in order to be taken seriously in the post-war period, you really needed to have proven yourself as one of these 14 million men who had served in the armed forces. It's not an accident that in the 1952 election, Americans flocked to support Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a war hero, and in the post-war period, this participation that people had in the war, in many ways, is what defines their social value, and is what imparts to them social capital. Of course, this is going to become increasingly complex, particularly for people like African Americans and members of any number of minority groups who didn't have this opportunity. And of course, one of the things that it does is it helps to sort of institutionalize at a cultural level this image of the middle-class white war veteran as the ideal exemplar of American citizenship. This was a period of extraordinary economic growth. In fact, unlike other wars in American history, the U.S. economy didn't slip into recession or depression immediately following the war. In fact, the gross domestic product of the United States just kept growing from $222.3 billion in 1956, more than doubling to $526.4 billion within 14 years. And that is absolutely amazing economic growth. If you think about it, as the economy grows, doubles within a 14-year period, what we're looking at is economic growth at about the rate of 5% or more every year. Now, economists today say that 3% economic growth is good, and anything less than 3% economic growth is, cause for worry. Anything more than 3% economic growth is amazing. Even when we were looking at the growth of the Chinese economy in the last decade, and we were talking about how, oh my God, the Chinese economy is growing at this incredible rate, it didn't actually grow at quite the same rate that the U.S. economy did between 1946 and 1960. And make no mistake, the United States had the most thriving, the most aggressively growing economy in the post-war period. The per capita gross domestic product, which is a metric that represents what everyone would get if you just divided up all the wealth in a country from a given year, was almost $10,000. Compared to France, where the per capita GDP was just a little over $5,000, it indicates that the United States was, in some cases, as much as twice as wealthy as its next closest economic rivals. And the per capita GDP in the United States grew at a phenomenal rate, at about 35% for the entire decade of the 1950s. I mean, if you think about this, what it means is that by the end of the decade, the average American is, at least statistically, 35% wealthier than he was at the beginning of the decade. Now, there are a number of economic indicators that really show just, how thriving the U.S. economy was in this period. For example, the unemployment rate settled to somewhere between 3 and 4% for the entire decade, which is an indication of almost full employment. 3 to 4% unemployment rate is an indication of just the people moving between jobs. And so what we see in this period is this incredible growth and incredible prosperity in the United States. And one of the places we see this is how the income level that the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States defines as middle class grew from about 31% of the population before 1920 to 60% of the population after 1955. The period of the mid-1940s until until the end of the 1960s is a period when a higher proportion of Americans were able to share in the highest possible economic growth and national economic prosperity. And of course, one of the manifestations of this is that the workforce was becoming increasingly white-collar or professionalized. For example, the number of salaried workers increased 61% in the decade between 1947 and 1957. Now, this is a significant number because salaried workers are workers that, first of all, are doing a managerial, what we generally think of as middle-class occupations. Secondly, these are workers who are able to take advantage of certain kinds of benefits like sick days, vacation, and even health insurance. And so what we're seeing here is a transformation of American society. It's also worth pointing out, however, that once again, the people who are most able to take advantage of these changes and the people who, in many cases, benefit from these changes are the white middle class. After all, the growth of the white-collar professions in the United States, to a great extent, reflects the effects of the GI Bill in training up veterans who were, as a result of military segregation, disproportionately white and middle class, training them up to more professional kinds of occupations. So what's driving all of this? Well, the GI Bill has an awful lot to do with this. It did ensure that there was a large population of Americans, 14 million veterans, or probably about 9 million of the 14 million veterans, who actually had money in their pockets immediately upon leaving the armed forces. It doesn't sound like an awful lot, but the unemployment benefits amounted to about $20 a week for 52 weeks. Doesn't sound like a lot, but bear in mind that this is 1945 and $20 a week goes a hell of a lot further, which means that immediately after leaving the armed forces, they're able to participate in the economy, and therefore they're able to help the economy grow. There were also the government-funded university and vocational education programs, which required universities and colleges to hire new staff, and not just hire new staff, but to expand their various facilities. The Newark Colleges of Rutgers University in 1945 was actually a relatively small set of buildings, but they had to grow rapidly in the post-war period in order to accommodate all of these new students. Initially, actually, many students at Rutgers Newark went to classes in trailers and Quonset huts, but over time, more and more facilities were being built throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Of course, you had to pay people to build the facilities. You had to pay companies for the materials to build the buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this helps to stimulate the economy. The availability of no down payment mortgages, guaranteed mortgages with very, very low interest rates, also helped to stimulate the building trades. When a GI returned from the Second World War, came home to, the Ironbound, and found out that he could buy a new home or have a new home built for him in, any part of suburban New Jersey. Well, he certainly considered this, and in order to do this, of course, some developer made money off the sale of the house. The people who made the concrete for the foundations made money selling the concretes, the lumber yards, the carpenters, the construction crews, and all of this helped to stimulate this incredible growth in the building trades. And so one of the things that we see, thanks to the GI Bill, is just this incredible, ongoing growth in the economy. There had also been a pent-up demand. We're going to be talking about this in more detail in a moment, but it's important to realize that in 1945, the U.S. economy has not been normal since 1929. Stop and think about that. For 16 years, the United States economically has been in some form of crisis, either the Great Depression or the Second World War. And now some of the consequences of this is that even if you had money, there was not an awful lot that you could spend your money on. And in fact, most people during the Great Depression didn't actually have money that they could spend on consumer items. The big automakers, for example, didn't produce any cars for the civilian market between 1942 and 1945. Most of the cars that they did make, when they were making cars at all, were actually procured by the armed forces for staff cars or for trucks. And even then, most of the big automobile manufacturers weren't even making cars. They were making dive bombers and they were making tanks. Sherman tanks were rolling off the Ford assembly lines, and engines and B-25 bombers were rolling off the Chevrolet assembly lines. The problem is, even if you had money during the 1940s, during the boom years of the war economy, there were actually very few places where you could spend it. You couldn't buy records. You couldn't buy record players. You could listen to music on the radio, but there was nothing to do. And so when the war ends, there had been this economic recovery during the war years, and there were a lot of people who had an awful lot of money left over. And there were people in the population, in the economy, who now had new money thanks to the GI Bill. And the pent-up demand since 1929 meant that people started buying all sorts of things. And of course, that helped to drive the economy. U.S. international trade recovered fairly quickly. You might remember from yesterday's lecture when I was talking about the Marshall Plan, which was this vast government foreign aid program around the world that was designed in part to prevent the expansion or the appeal of communism in places like Great Britain or France or Italy. It also had the other effect of putting enough money into these economies to create consumer economies, but before their local or domestic industries had actually recovered. And of course, what this meant was U.S. international trade actually was stimulated by the growth of foreign markets, which were able to benefit from American foreign aid. In fact, the U.S. economy and U.S. industry was one of the few that had not been crippled by war. And in fact, the U.S. industries had used the war economy to expand their operations, putting them in a position where they were able to, really, really develop in this. Of course, that explains the other part of this, in that there was a continued war footing. Thanks to the Cold War and thanks to the National Security Act of 1947 and NSC 68 in 1950, the United States remained in a position of military readiness. And if you remember that graph from yesterday's lecture of American military spending, well, that is money that is primarily, 99%, being paid to American defense contractors and manufacturers. And of course, with this, one of the things that happens is we see this huge expansion, first of all, in industry, but also in technological development, military production, science, and all of these things. And so all of these effects together, they come together and they create this massive not overheated, but really hot growth economy. Thanks largely to U.S. government investment in the economy and the stimulus of the GI Bill, but also to other factors like the pent-up consumer demand, which had been denied since 1929. One of the things that Elizabeth Cohen notes, of course, is that consumer spending promised a better life through consumption. And there is this sense that everyone had a role to play in the economy, this sense of consumer citizenship, this idea that by buying American products and by using your money in the economy in this way, you were a player in the economy just like anyone else, which of course is another thing that drives the economic growth of the period. With more Americans having more money and building new homes, particularly in the suburbs, in fact, more Americans owned cars. By 1960, 75% of all American families owned a car. That probably doesn't sound like a big deal today, but if you compare that to the numbers from before the Great Depression, or certainly at the very beginning of the Great Depression, when only about half, in fact less than half, of American families owned cars, it indicates a huge change in the way Americans relate to the automobile and other things. And of all of the industries in the American economy in the post-war period, the automobile industry was by far the most important in the economic growth. Now, part of this was by design, because in the post-war period, there's finally somewhere to go, largely because of government intervention. In 1956, for example, the federal government passes legislation to create a huge number of new highways. 41,000 miles of interstate highways are produced as a part of the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956. Now, that's significant because, on one hand, highways are considered to be sort of a strategic value, a strategic benefit. In the event of a Soviet attack, the thinking goes, we can mobilize our forces as necessary and as effectively as possible. But that was actually, in some ways, just the justification for the plan to build highways. And the Interstate Highway Act was heavily lobbied by the automobile industry, which was taking reconversion money from the federal government to convert back to peacetime manufacturing, and wanted to stimulate the growth of the market. It was inspired to some extent by the Autobahn. But the real reason for it was, on one hand, industrial demand from the major automakers, but on the other hand, changes in the structure and the ways in which Americans were living. Now, it had a number of very, very important impacts in American life and American society. For one thing, for the first time, it was easy to travel outside of your region. Now, if you've ever taken the New Jersey Turnpike, and I'm sure all of you have, you know that the Turnpike ends at the borders of New Jersey. And if you're driving south to Florida, you have to get off the New Jersey Turnpike and on to the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and then continue down, get off the Pennsylvania Turnpike, get onto the Delaware Turnpike, etc., 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 etc. You'd much rather take a straight shot, and the way you do that is by getting on the interstate. The problem is, before the construction of the interstates, you couldn't do that. But with this ability to travel outside of the region, Americans began to, be interested in traveling outside of the region. It helped to stimulate this car culture and all of the economic activities alongside the highways, whether we're talking about motels. And motel is basically a portmanteau for motor hotel. The idea is that this is a small hotel at the side of the road where automobile travelers can stop for a night and continue their travels, but also fast food and drive-in movies and all of these economic and social and cultural activities that are closely related to the highway, to highway building, and to the automobile. Another thing that the highway building campaign, the highway building period did, and was really encouraged by the automobile industry itself, is it diverted home starts, that is, residential construction, away from the cities, traditional places of high population density, to the suburbs. The idea was that, and you think about it, we have this whole class of Americans, these veterans who are able to take advantage of the GI Bill benefits, who have the money to invest in new homes. Well, if you're interested in making money in real estate, you're not going to sell them a home in an already congested city. You're not going to try to rent them an apartment. What you want to do is create a neighborhood where they can buy their very own home using the loans and supports from the federal government in order to do this. Now, what's interesting about this is the automobile industry and the large automakers got very closely involved in real estate development and real estate speculation. A large number of the major real estate developers, for example, the Levitt company, had capital funding and support from automakers. In that particular case, in that case, Ford. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that the suburb was created by the car. The Levittowns in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were designed specifically with the car in mind. You couldn't live there unless you owned a car. You couldn't get anywhere from there without a car. I mean, think about living in the suburbs, and if you want to do anything, you absolutely have to have a car. And so, although suburbs had existed before the Second World War, and there are a number of them, Montclair is a classic example of the pre-war suburb. After the Second World War, we see the emergence of the specific automobile suburb, where there are all these small homes in residential subdivisions, each with their own lawn, their own yard, and always a garage. And the only way that you can get to your job from there is by car, because there are very few trains. Or if you want to go to the train station, you're going to have to drive to the train station in your car. Or if you wanted to go to the supermarket, you can't just, open the door and walk a block away to the local bodega, because there isn't one. You got to get into your car. And this whole convergence on one hand of government policy in highway building. It's not just the federal government. State governments are doing it as well. It's at this time that the state of New Jersey builds the Garden State Parkway. But there's a convergence of government policy and government projects. The expansion of the automobile industry, the GI Bill that allows veterans to buy new properties, real estate development, in many cases encouraged and supported by the automobile industry, and all of these other things that come together to create this incredible growth and dependence on cars. And before you think that this was, entirely accidental, it's not. In fact, the plan was to make it impossible to live in America, even in the cities, without a car. If any of you have ever taken the Newark subway system, you probably know you can't really go too far on it. What you might not know is it used to be far more extensive. And one of the things that began happening after the Second World War is increasingly automobile companies, manufacturers, whether we're talking about General Motors or Ford or the Chrysler companies, began to buy up local public transit companies that ran the subways and streetcars in cities the size of New York, but also cities the size of Newark, cities the size of Jersey City or Topeka or St. Louis and whatever. They would buy up the public transit utilities, which were always privately owned, and then they would shut them down. They would pave over the rails so you couldn't take a streetcar or a subway to work. And if you wanted to go to work, you either had to take a bus manufactured by the automobile industries, or you had to own a car, which you would buy from the automobile companies themselves. And what do you do when you live in the suburbs? I mean, what do you do for entertainment and what do you do for fun? Well, since the 1920s in the United States, as you recall, if you wanted entertainment, you usually went out to see a movie. Movie viewership was, in some ways sort of a national passion. This is why, if you think of the great movies of American history, a lot of these are movies from the 1930s and 1940s, because there weren't actually a lot of other, opportunities for entertainment. Yes, there was music. You could go hear live music. You could listen to your records at home. You listen to the radio. But for the most part, the biggest entertainment business in the United States was the movie business. The problem is, if you live in the suburbs, how do you go see a movie? I mean, it's easy if you're living in a city like in Jersey City. You want to go see a movie, you walk a couple of blocks, you'll find yourself at the Lowe's Jersey City, which, if you've ever been to Jersey City, is right across the street from the Journal Square Path Station. It's this old movie theater that has been there since 1929, and that's where people would go. And that's great if you live in the city, but what if you live in the suburbs? Well, if you live in the suburbs, it's not so easy, because the movie theaters aren't all that close. The suburbs don't have the density of population necessary to support a 300-seat movie theater. And as a result, you have to hop in the car and go somewhere, which is fine if you don't have other responsibilities. But if you are a parent and you have kids, what are you going to do? You're going to load your 3 and 5-year-old kids in your station wagon and drive to see a movie? Actually, many movie theaters didn't even let children in them, and so you had to get yourself a babysitter, which was fine if you could find a babysitter, but that really wasn't all that easy. And as a result, there was this growing demand in the post-war period to find some sort of entertainment that you didn't have to leave home for, and that technology was the television. Now, the television was invented before the Second World War. It was invented simultaneously by a number of people. Philo Farnsworth in the United States often gets the credit, but it was also invented around the same time by German engineers and by engineers in the Soviet Union. The first regular television service in the United States was provided by W3XK in Washington, D.C., but there wasn't much broadcasting. W3XK actually broadcast, if I'm not mistaken, for about 2.5 hours per day, only 5 days a week. And to be honest, most TV sets were really expensive because they weren't mass produced. If you bought a TV set in, say, 1940, you probably had to have one specially made. And having something specially made is always going to be expensive. By 1942, despite this, there were already 5,000 TV sets in operation in the United States. So people were interested in doing this. And, just to visualize this, the TV sets had tiny, tiny little screens, about 6 inches across, that were hard to view. But nonetheless, they were there. The war, of course, changed everything, and in 1945, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, began a crash project to see if they could adapt some of the technologies that they had developed as military contractors during the Second World War to make some money in the peacetime. And as it turns out, one of the things that RCA manufactured was radar scopes. Now, if you've ever seen a movie with, a radar room and the radar operators are staring at this scope, this screen that has a lit green on a black background, and there's a sweeping arm that goes around. Well, that's a radar scope, and it's a cathode ray tube, and in fact, it is exactly the technology that you need for television. And as a result, in 1946, RCA was able to start selling mass-produced televisions based on the technology that they developed for the Second World War. They were priced at $350, which in 1946 dollars was a huge sum of money. You may note that today a television still costs about $350, and it's a little bit less money because of changes in currency. But nonetheless, in the first year, they managed to sell 10,000 TVs. In fact, RCA in 1946 alone sold more TVs, twice as many TVs than existed in the United States the previous year. And because RCA did it, other companies began to jump on the bandwagon. The following year, in 1947, television manufacturers sold 30,000 TVs, bringing the number to 44,000 TVs in ownership in the United States. And by 1959, 44 million American homes had TVs. Some had 2. Now, if you think about this, more homes, more families in 1959 have televisions than have cars. In fact, in 1959, most American families in all economic levels have at least one television. The impact of television is absolutely phenomenal, and in some ways it's even more profound than the impact of the automobile, because what television provides is a single homogenizing cultural content. Everyone is watching the same thing, and you may not be aware of this today because most people consume their television content on the internet or in a variety of forms. But when there was one really important TV show, say the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night, the vast majority of people who own televisions, that is, the vast majority of Americans, would have watched that show, giving Americans from all walks of life this single unifying experience that crossed region and erased regional differences. What it meant was, the experience that people had thanks to the motion picture and movies, where all of a sudden we had this experience of shared national taste, regardless of where you happen to live in the United States, was greatly amplified and made immediate because everyone would see the same thing at the same time. This is one of the reasons why from the 1950s onward, when people talk about these formative experiences in their lives and really important cultural experiences, whether it's the Beatles or the first time they saw Elvis Presley or the experience of learning of John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, people always evoke the experience of watching television. Television becomes the place where, people are interacting with each other. A great media theorist named Marshall McLuhan called this the global village, that, regardless of where you are, thanks to the technology, we're all part of the same community in some way. And the TV became sort of the cultural focus in the home. But an interesting thing about American history and what gives the television a particular wrinkle in the American experience is that the United States is the only place in the world where all television programming is advertising supported, and certainly at this period. I mean, the BBC, which is the first television broadcaster in Great Britain, is a government-run public broadcaster. The CBC in Canada is the same thing. Radio-Télévision France is also the same thing. But in the United States, if you're watching television presented to you by companies like the American Broadcasting Company, like the National Broadcasting Company, and by the Columbia Broadcasting System, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they make their money not through tax dollars and not through government grants, but by selling you stuff. And they sell you stuff by selling ad time on their programs so that advertisers will be able to reach a captive audience. Now, what this means is that television broadcasters, at some level, were dependent on the advertisers for, their livelihood, for their very existence. And as a result, they would rarely promote or broadcast content that their advertisers thought was too controversial. And here's the thing, companies tend to be risk averse. And say, for example, you're a company that sells washing machines, say your Maytag. Do you want to have an ad for your washing machine on Game of Thrones? I mean, I think it'd be kind of interesting, gets the blood out of your cloak or whatever. But do you in the 1950s? I mean, do you want people to associate your product that you have bought advertising time to promote with violence or unhappiness? Which is actually one of the reasons why in the 1950s, so much television broadcasting is basically very happy. The classic 1950s television program is the sitcom. And the classic sitcom of this period always tells the story of happy families, happy families living the suburban life, because what they're trying to do is to reach other suburban homeowners, the people who they identify as the best market for their products. They want to reach other suburban homeowners, and they want the suburban homeowners watching their TV shows to feel good about it. I mean, this is one of the reasons why if you watch these sitcoms, or whether it's The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, or Leave It to Beaver, or Father Knows Best, there might be conflicts within the families, tiny conflicts in the families, but everything is always resolved because in order to sell products to the primarily middle-class, suburban white audience that the advertisers want to reach, they want to reassure the primarily middle-class white suburban audience that everything is okay. This is actually one of the reasons why you rarely see African Americans on American television in the 1950s, except as servants or as secondary characters. There's a television show, the Andy Griffith Show from the 1960s, which is actually a case in point. It's supposed to take place in South Carolina, and there's not a single black character in the entire TV show. And part of the reason is that advertisers don't want to reach a black market. They know that the growth market for consumers, the growth consumer market in the 1950s and the 1960s is the white middle class market, and so those are the people that they want to represent. And when they do this, the images that they send out are very normalizing. It's the ideal home where there is very little conflict, where Ozzie and Harriet have their adventures. The idea is that you can be happy like these people if you live your life according to the way these people live their lives and buy the same products that these people buy. If you get a chance, you should go onto YouTube and see if you can find, some episodes from these 1950s sitcoms. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, and you get a sense of how the message they're trying to promote is this idea of happiness in being normal. In fact, you can understand the 1950s to some extent as the age of normal. Normal or a norm is a statistical idea, but it's extended to be kind of an ideal during the 1950s. There is a whole rise of normalizing practices and professions and psychology and social work in the period of the 1950s, which are, in many ways trying to make sure that people are happy by making sure they remain normal. These have been around for many decades, and they'd done great work. But with public and governing desire and sort of the hegemonic pressure to return to normal after the crisis years of the Great Depression and the war, disciplines like these and others began to focus on making people and families, feel normal, which, of course, raises a serious challenge for people because, like all ideals, normal is usually observed in its breach. Not being completely normal in a society that prizes normal and defines normal in very, very specific ways can create a great deal of anxiety and tension. The key thing to remember, as I said before, is that 14 million American men had served in the military in World War II, and their absence from the economy and their return, as well as government support for policies to return to normalcy, had a profound impact. The wartime mobilization of women had ended. You remember during the Second World War, women were welcomed into the workforce in the absence of men, but when the men were back, what happens? What does Willard Waller say? And you might want to discuss that in your online discussion. What does Willard Waller say about women who work and normalcy? One of the things that we see in the 1950s above all is the invention of an idea of the normal nuclear family. And it's similar to the family that we see portrayed in the media at the time. This is the happy, stable family with a mom and a dad and statistically 2.3 kids. Although I don't think any family actually had 0.3 kids. It's, a question of how you mix the numbers statistically. There's also a strong rearticulation of this ideology of separate spheres. Famously, Adlai Stevenson, who ran for president in 1952 and 1956 on the Democratic ticket, gave a speech at Smith College to the graduating class of one of the elite women's colleges in America. And basically he said, congratulations on graduating, congratulations on getting these degrees. Now you're going to go home and have babies. And that, when we think about normal, and we think about this idea of returning to normal, is actually a really, really powerful idea. Because what is combined in these ideas, whether it's Adlai Stevenson or the Waller reading you read for this class, is that after 16 years of not being normal, it was time to turn back the clock to return to normal, even though the normal as it was imagined in the 1950s wasn't exactly the same normal that had existed before. This rearticulation of gender roles is actually something which is very much formed by the wartime experience. I don't want you to think that gender roles are created in some secret office in government, where a bunch of guys sit around in shirt sleeves, figuring out how people are going to live. That's not how it works. Gender roles and other ideologies are ideas that are generally shared. People tend to agree with them, publicly, even if they don't necessarily buy into them privately. These are ideas that tend to be communicated through education, popular culture, media, and they're questions that we don't generally challenge. We sort of accept them as basic common sense. And these ideas were in many ways were formed by the profound and traumatic experience of the Second World War. What the wartime experience said is that there was a particular, kind of man, that you proved your masculinity in the war, which meant that if you didn't serve in the armed forces during the Second World War, you were one of the minority of young men of serving age who was either unfit for combat or chose not to enlist or chose not to accept the draft. Your masculinity would be, consistently in doubt. And in an intensely consumer-focused society, as we see following the Second World War, and above all in the 1950s and the 1960s, masculinity became associated with the ability to participate as a consumer. This is the whole idea of the consumer's republic and consumer citizenship, the ability to provide for a family and maintain it in comfort. Now, part of this is that it's a way to say, look at me, I have arrived economically, and clearly I've arrived economically because I have benefited from the GI Bill, and I've benefited from the GI Bill because I served honorably in the armed forces. That's certainly part of it. It's also reinforced by many of these other messages that people hear and see in the popular culture, but also in the way that the ideas are structured, that manhood and masculinity is ultimately tied to fatherhood, home ownership, and all of these things, and also a status of conspicuous consumption, because if your masculinity is tied to your economic prowess, your economic ability, and your consumer citizenship, how better do you show that you are a good economic citizen by making sure that you always have the latest car? Now, femininity ties into this as well. And if you can remember back to this discussion we had about separate spheres, femininity is associated with maintaining the home, providing for the family, and above all, providing for men. What this means is, although there's no law against it, all of the social and cultural messages that women start to receive following the Second World War, these messages that to be a true woman, you need to go home and raise a family. If you're not doing that, there must be something wrong with you. Maybe you can't find a man. Maybe there's something perverse about you. Maybe you don't know what's good for you. And of course, one of the things that we see in this period is that the median marriage age for women fell to the age of 20 by the beginning of the 1950s. Now, what that means, if you think about it, statistically, half of all women who were married at the beginning of the 1950s were below the age of 20. This is the youngest marriage age that the United States has seen, probably even since the 18th century. Birth rates rose in this period to 25.3 births per 1,000 women by 1957. And we're going to discuss the impact of that when we talk about the baby boom and the rise of youth culture in a later class. Now, of course, some of the consequences of this were that, if you were a woman, you could, in theory, go to college, get a degree, get a job, become a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or lead a business. There was no law prohibiting you from doing this, but there were all of these attitudes in society in which people thought that was, not really quite normal. And so there's a huge pressure on women to become housewives, particularly middle-class white women who are told, the best way that they can behave and the healthiest, most normal thing that they can do in a society that really enforces normal is, not to go get your degree, but to go off and meet the man of your dreams and have a happy family. In fact, the proportion of college students who are women dropped from a high of about 47% in the mid 1920s to 35% in the 1950s. And even if you did go to college, you were actually statistically highly unlikely to actually graduate with a degree. In fact, what people were saying at the time, and you can read this in the popular culture, and you can read this in newspapers and books and see it on TV shows, is that rather than going to get their BA or BSc in college, one of the reasons for a woman to go to college would be to get her MRS degree. So you need to ask yourself, and again, maybe this is something you should discuss in the online discussion forum, what kind of tensions would this create in society? What are some of the things, the stresses that women might feel? I mean, if you are a woman, think about how you would feel in a society that these ideas of femininity were considered normal. Think about, how ideas of normal are enforced, not through hard power, but through soft power in a society. I've put a couple of instructional films up on the Blackboard site in the media folder for you to watch. It's not required, but you might want to see the kind of messages that particularly young people are getting in the late 40s and the early 50s. These were films produced by, well, in this case, Coronet Films, that were designed to be shown to teenagers to explain life and social activity, to basically put them on the right path when they were in high school. And frequently these were films that would be shown in high school civics classes or high school health classes. And so these are the messages, that many teenagers in the 1950s would have got. What you should do is watch these films and what are the roles, the gender roles that these films are instructing young people to observe. What do they say? What is acceptable behavior? What is unacceptable behavior? And in the online discussion, I want you to talk about, what kind of behavior is, how is the behavior disciplined? What are the consequences of not acting normal? But the normative representations of family life and of gender, were everywhere, and these representations hid and to some extent, created cracks in the family itself. There was a strong sense of the closing down of options and alternatives for women, but it also closed down options and alternatives for men. You can read Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, from 1963, in which she talks about the utter hell of being a suburban housewife in the early 1960s. But you can also read novels like Sloane Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit from 1955 and Richard Yates's book Revolutionary Road from 1961, which suggest that although there is this incredible pressure on people to conform to this idea of normal, it creates incredible tension. Now, the official, not really official because it's not published anywhere, but the generally accepted representation of family and gender is actually, I think, best represented by this cover of Life magazine from January of 1953. You look at it, and here is the American and his economy, and it seems to explain everything that we need to know about normal, because this guy is the American. It's represented as, the all-American normal family. And who is the American? Well, we know it's not the wife because it's the American and his family. We see the sense that, everyone has a place and they know it, and they look really happy, or maybe they don't look so happy in retrospect, but they're supposed to look happy because they have the dream. They've got mom and dad and the 3 kids. They're posing in this stylized suburban window. This is the family that has everything, and the family that has everything, that knows the rules and plays by the rules, is the family that is harmonious and fulfilled. This is a family where, I'm sure, and we would hear this frequently in the literature of the time, they have a very, very happy, but entirely entirely marital sex life. Sexuality was contained within the context of the family, and although it was not understood as being solely for procreation, I mean, this is the 1950s, where this is the modern world. It is monogamous, and it does create happiness in itself, not just in the act of sex, but also in producing this perfect family. The problem, of course, is this representation was far from the truth. And as early as 1953, researchers, anthropologists, sociologists, and social scientists were actually finding that, in fact, most American families weren't like this. Most of American families weren't perfectly harmonious. There were stresses, whether they were economic stresses, or whether they were social stresses. I'm sure there were many families that approximate this issue, but there were as many families where, dad who works in the city in a large insurance company during the day, has a little affair going on the side, so he's clearly not happy. And how does he feel if this is what he's doing and he's told that he should be happy? What about his wife, who is, constantly feeling this pressure to conform, and yet in conforming, she never feels fully satisfied or fulfilled. Let's say she did complete her degree from Smith College or Rutgers University or Bryn Mawr, and she has this 4-year degree, but she never uses it, and all she does is change diapers and clean spit up from her shoulders. And so one of the things that I think, we need to address as we talk about this image of the incredibly happy family of the 1950s, and this myth that we have of stability and contentment and in the 1950s, is the fact that not everyone was content, but they were expected to be. And this itself created the stresses which ultimately were going to break down the facade of the American dream. Now, we'll be talking about that in a later class. In our next lecture, we're going to turn our attention to another one of the cracks in the facade of the post-war American consensus. In fact, in many ways, this is the biggest crack, and that is the racial politics of the post-war, and above all, the emergence of the post-war civil rights movement. In some ways, this is the best news in all the lectures that we're going to have in this course, because this is kind of the good news. And so please read carefully. Your readings for the class include 3 primary sources. The Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education from 1954, James Farmer's famous essay, If Not Now, When, and Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail.